The date was March 3rd, 1897. The Musikverein in Vienna, Austria was packed for a performance of Brahms' Fourth Symphony. Unusual for such a sophisticated audience, at the end of each movement, applause would break out. Applause that would swell to a standing ovation and would persist until a frail figure in one of the private boxes would make his way to the rail to acknowledge the ovation. Johannes Brahms, the composer, was making what would be his final concert appearance. 1 month later, he would lie on his deathbed. The entire city of Vienna would turn out for his funeral. Centuries later, musicians still make their way to his grave and memorial. But today, we are not studying the mature, bearded Brahms beloved by Österreich. Today, we are looking at the Brahms of the Deutsche Requiem. Ours is the young, clean-shaven Brahms, born in Hamburg, who at age 20 introduced himself to Robert and Clara Schumann. Robert politely directed Johannes to their piano, where Brahms began to play. After just a few bars, Robert cried out, "Clara, come here quickly. You must hear this, my dear. Young man, please begin again." Later, Clara was to write, "This month introduced us to a wonderful person, Brahms, a composer from Hamburg, 20 years old. He played us sonatas and scherzos, all of his own devising. One cannot but think that the good God sent him into the world ready-made." As if this were not enough praise, Robert himself a few weeks later published in the popular magazine Neue Zeitschrift für Musik the article entitled Neue Bahnen, or New Roads, where he wrote, "He is come, a young blood, over whose graces heroes kept watch. His name is Johannes Brahms, and he bore every sign that would announce to us, this is a chosen one." I'm guessing that his midichlorian count was very, very high. Schumann went on, "If he were to wave his magic baton, where the massed powers of chorus and orchestra lend him their force, even more wonderful glimpses into the mysteries of the Spirit would be in store for us." It's hard to fathom how Robert Schumann could make such predictions at this stage, when Brahms had hardly yielded a baton as either orchestral or choral conductor. But a decade later, Robert's prediction would be vindicated when Brahms published Ein deutsches Requiem. When I consider a composer in his mere 30s, I think of certain modern choral composers as a comparison. Perhaps take someone like the young Eric Whitacre. While I'm not attempting to compare Eric to Brahms in genius, physically, this young blood is our Brahms of the German Requiem. How did such a young composer produce a work of such profound meaning and maturity? Let us briefly consider Brahms' world of the 19th century. Abraham Lincoln was elected president, fought the Civil War, and was assassinated. Charles Darwin published his On the Origin of Species in 1859, and shortly thereafter Nietzsche declared that God is dead in 1882, after which he, of course, went mad and became himself dead in 1900. This, though, was the era of Thomas Edison, who invented the phonograph and then demonstrated electric lighting in Menlo Park, California, declaring that electricity will become so cheap that only the rich will burn candles. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone and founded AT&T in 1855, while Eiffel completed his tower in Paris. During this age of invention, Brahms was serving as the director of the Musikverein in Vienna, and he was known to delight in each new scientific discovery and gadget. A close Swiss friend of Brahms wrote of Brahms, saying, "Even the smallest discovery thoroughly delighted him. Brahms could not praise enough the electric light, Edison's phonograph, and other life-enhancing wonders of the day." In fact, if you look more closely at this historic photograph and focus on Brahms' left ear, musically, the century witnessed the passing of Ludwig van Beethoven. Robert and Clara Schumann were the preeminent composer and performer in residence in Germany and Vienna. These figures represented the classical music form that some would describe as Absolute Musik. But against this rose the new German school, championed by Liszt and Wagner. Brahms favored the classicists and was frankly worried about the increasing nationalism and bigotry he saw, particularly in Wagner. "Anti-Semitism is madness," he declared to a group of friends in Vienna in 1895. "It is so despicable to me." Instead, he urged composers to study the classics, writing, "Study Bach. There you will find everything." In the Zurich Tonhalle, the ceiling at that time was frescoed with mostly historic composers. We see Handel and Mozart, among others, here to the right. But looking to the left, we see the three Bs: Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms. Brahms is portrayed peering over the shoulder of Beethoven. This ceiling was contemporary with Brahms, who performed here more than once, and who saw himself thus honored. The great conductor of that era, Hans von Bülow, lauded that Brahms' First Symphony should be called Beethoven's 10th. Returning to our timeline, history and styles move on, and the new Romantic era expanded with the likes of Tchaikovsky, Dvorak, Mahler, and many others. So, how do all these threads of history and influence lead to the production of Brahms' Deutsche Requiem? Shortly after the youthful Brahms, at 20 years old, met Robert and Clara Schumann, Robert suffered an untimely demise. His death may have been the spark that begun the idea of a requiem in the young Johannes' mind. But ultimately, it was the death of his mother, Joanna, 10 years later, that officially marked the beginnings of Brahms' compositional activity on what would become Ein deutsches Requiem, first performed in Vienna in 1867, when Brahms was only 34 years young. Although Brahms was rooted in the standards, his Requiem would decidedly not follow classical liturgical forms. The evidence is plain to see in the first official publication of the work in 1868 out of Leipzig. Brahms entitled it Ein deutsches Requiem. Note that the small case D in Deutsches and the simple use of ein, not das. This is not das deutsche Requiem or the German Requiem. Rather, it is simply ein deutsche Requiem, small case, a German Requiem, or one might say, a Requiem in German. This was not a nationalistic work. Brahms had merely chosen to put it in the vernacular language of his time instead of Latin, as Handel had done with the Messiah. In fact, Brahms is recorded to have said, "As for the title, I must admit that I would just as soon leave off the German and simply put human. We might have had ein menschliches Requiem." The second point one might draw from the original publication is on the second line, where Brahms stipulated nach Worten der Heiligen Schrift, or after words from the Holy Bible. Well, don't all masses and requiems take their words from the Bible? Strictly speaking, the term requiem was reserved for works that were a subset of the Mass itself. And the Mass was a Roman Catholic form, established at that time most recently by the Council of Trent in 1563. Mozart's Requiem is an excellent example of a strict liturgical Requiem Mass. Requiem Masses often start with Requiem aeternam and end with Lux aeternam. While these are certainly biblical ideas, this liturgy was actually written and approved by canonical scholars, priests, and their committees. In fact, if you do a simple search of the Bible, while you will find the words requiem, or rest, and you will also find the words aeternam, or eternal, you will not, in fact, however, find them used together. Nowhere in the Bible itself is requiem aeternam explicitly promised. This isn't to say that these ideas aren't true. Priests and pastors routinely interpret and homiletically expound on topics whose principles derive from the Bible, no argument. But Brahms decided to include nothing that did not literally come from a direct biblical quotation. Now, I suspect that Brahms was at least in part being very Lutheran here. One of Luther's foremost points of deviation from the Roman Church was his understanding of the term sola scriptura, or from Scripture only, an idea Luther espoused perhaps to try and separate the Holy Scriptures themselves from the extra-biblical writings, interpretations, and traditions of the Roman Church. So Brahms would use nothing that was not a direct quotation from his Luther Bible. If, for example, we open our scores to the first movement, and then open our Bibles to Matthew chapter 5, we find the Beatitudes. There in verse 4 we read, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." Now switching to the Luther German translation, again in verse 4, "Selig sind, die da Leid tragen, denn sie sollen getröstet werden," which are exactly the words Brahms reproduced in his libretto, word for word, with even the punctuation largely preserved. To a great extent, because Brahms did not adhere to the liturgical traditions, to that same extent, Brahms' Requiem is perhaps the most personal requiem we have. A requiem that shares better than most the convictions of the composer. Some modern commentators try to turn Brahms into an atheist, claiming that his personal views tended to be humanistic and skeptical. Here is an example from a commentary written in 1997. Brahms' Requiem employs biblical texts to speak words of comfort to the bereaved, while generally omitting statements concerning salvation or immortality. What libretto did this commentator read? Here are some examples of Brahms' biblical quotations. "Although all flesh is as grass, Yet those who mourn should take comfort, for the souls of the righteous are in the hands of God. And beautiful dwelling places have been prepared for the redeemed who shall return. Not quietly, no eternal peace, but with shouts of joy. Ewige Freude. Death is swallowed up in victory. Hölle, wo ist dein Sieg? Where is your victory? So while one might say that Brahms omitted doctrinal credo sections, or Day of Wrath or Dies Irae reports of divine judgment, one can hardly say that he did not include redemption or immortality in his choices. In fact, by my measure, he spent more time covering redemption and eternal joy than he does speaking of mourning or withering of our mortal flesh. How, in fact, did Brahms compose? What was his muse? When I feel the urge to compose, I begin by appealing directly to my Maker, and I first ask him the three most important questions pertaining to our life here in this world. Wow, what might these three most important questions be? Brahms outlined in German, Woher, warum, wohin? In English, this translates roughly to whence, or where do we come from? Wherefore, or why are we here? And then lastly, wohin, or whither? Where are we going? So if we apply these questions to our list of scriptural references, we find Brahms declaring, Woher, or what is our current condition? Although all flesh is as grass, yet those who mourn should take comfort. Warum, or why? Because the souls of the righteous are in the hands of God. And wohin, whither are we going, knowing these facts? To beautiful dwelling places, prepared for the redeemed who shall return with shouts of joy. Ewige Freude. Death is swallowed up in victory. Hölle, wo ist dein Sieg? So, we have begun with a bit of the life and times of Johannes Brahms. Next, in subsequent chapters, we will move through the 7 movements of Brahms Ein deutsches Requiem. We will see him again and again addressing his 3 questions, woher, warum, and wohin. Truly, as we explore the Deutsches Requiem, we will see Robert Schumann's prediction come to fruition as the massed powers of the chorus and orchestra lend Brahms their force, giving us wonderful glimpses into the mysteries of the Spirit. You can find these subsequent chapters on the youtube.com/TedHain webpage. Click the subscribe button, and you will be notified when subsequent chapters go online. Hope to see you there.